Okay, last video for Unit 5. Today we've got to do the issues and the effects of Reconstruction and the Civil War on the United States as a whole. In the South, we are going to see our second biggest case that we need to know for this unit. The first was Dred Scott v. Stanford, and the second is Plessy versus Ferguson. Plessy versus Ferguson is going to start with Homer Plessy. Homer Plessy was a man that was 7/8 white. Now, I know I always say that I'm not good at the maths, but 7/8 sounds like pretty close to 100% white. But in the South, a 7/8 white was not enough. Homer Plessy is going to refuse to use the separate railway car that was designated for black riders in Louisiana. This was known as the Jim Crow car. Remember, Jim Crow set up separate facilities for blacks and whites. When Plessy refuses to get in the Jim Crow car, he is arrested and he is found guilty. This is all staged, okay? The NAACP had put this together so that the law could be broken and be challenged in the court system. That is the only way to challenge laws, and this is how it was going to be done. This law is challenged all the way up to the Supreme Court. And when it gets to the Supreme Court decides that the Equal Protection Clause, saying that everybody is equally protected under all of the laws in the 14th Amendment, applied to recognition under the law and said that the courts, as long as there were separate cars, then that was okay. They said that the cars could be separate, they just had to be equal. Now, there was no stipulation made on what equal looked like, so when the court agrees that separate is okay and equal is mentioned, but not outlined on how it would be enforced or how it would be evaluated, the courts are basically saying Jim Crow and segregation is legal. This court case is monumental because instead of saying, okay, no, you can't have separate facilities, the court says, yeah, it's totally fine. Keep doing it. It's okay. And these pictures really show you what Jim Crow means. The white car in the top picture is in phenomenal shape versus the Jim Crow car. The water fountains down at the bottom, completely different. And this is going to be the reality of schools, of parts of town, and eventually when we move into the future for restaurants, for diners, there's going to be a significant difference between the Jim Crow section and the white section. This case is going to legalize Jim Crow laws, legal segregation in the South until the 1950s. This case is huge, and you will read about it for homework tonight. The new practices in the South. Remember, I said all of the laws, all of the regulation that was left to the states, all of it is going to be used to channel these newly freed slaves back into the plantation. Two such practices of this that you need to know for the regions. One, sharecropping. When we share something, we both use it, okay? If I share a pen with you, you're going to use it some of the time, I'm going to use it some of the time. We're sharing it. That is the idea under sharecropping for these large landowners. So what would happen is freed slaves and poor whites could borrow or share all of the supplies to work on the land and make land successful for farming, okay? Large landowners would say to freed slaves and poor whites, here, you can come and have this land. You can share all the supplies to work it. I'll give you this stuff to work the land, but you're going to have to donate the labor in order to pay for the supplies that I'm giving you. The owner in sharecropping of the land is going to control all of the crops and all of the profit. All of the income from the crops is going to be quote unquote used to pay the debt of the laborer for borrowing supplies, but really it's just going into the pocket of these large landowners. When we think of borrowing or sharing supplies here, I want you to think of it like a piece of gum. If somebody says, "Can I borrow a piece of gum?" you don't want that piece of gum back, okay? Just like if you borrow supplies to work the land, you can't give back seeds when you're done with it. The only way you can give it back is in the form of a grown crop. And that's what these landowners were saying. You can have this land, but you're going to pay us back for all of the supplies we let you borrow in crop yields and in your profits. So really nobody's making enough money under sharecropping to leave the land. They have to continue to stay and work it because they're in a cycle of debt. Tenant farming is the same idea. When you are a tenant, you are renting. Uh, Freed slaves and poor whites would rent land. They would rent housing, and in order to pay for that, the laborers would have to pay rent on the land, on the house, and they would do that by growing the crops, trying to make a profit. But even when they had control over the crops and over the profits, they couldn't get out of the cycle of debt. So in tenant farming, the laborer, the worker, has complete control over the crops and the profit they make. But since they're paying rent on the land and the housing, they can't get out of that because the rent that they were paying would be set so high that they would never make enough to move away or to purchase the land in and of itself. They still had to buy tools. Those tools were often bought on credit, like you use a credit card, you have to pay that back. So, sharecropping and tenant farming were two methods that the South is using to get that labor back on the plantations that they had lost in the Civil War. So, what were the effects of the Civil War on an area of the country that we have not talked about? We need to talk about the West, the wild, wild West. Uh, the U.S. was expanding from coast to coast, but the lands needed to be connected. So we were inspired to move to the West under this idea of manifest destiny that we were going to spread from sea to shining sea, and that the nation was going to prosper once we reached the Pacific coast. But once we did that, once we got that land, we had to figure out how the heck are people going to get out there? Because a covered wagon that's moving at 10 to 15 miles a day is not fast enough. And that's where the Transcontinental Railroad comes into play. The Transcontinental Railroad is going to be created under the Pacific Railway Act in 1863. This Pacific Railway Act commissioned or paid the Central Pacific Railroad and the Union Pacific Railroad to build. So the Central Pacific Railroad started building in Sacramento and continued east across the Sierra Nevada, while the Union Pacific Railroad would build westward from the Missouri River near the Iowa-Nebraska border. The two lines of track were supposed to meet in the middle, but the bill didn't really designate the exact location, and each company received 6,400 acres of land, which was later doubled to 12,800, and they received $48,000 in government funds for every mile of track that was built. So these two companies, the Central Pacific Railroad and the Union Pacific Railroad, were battling because they wanted more money. For every mile, if you made money in government bonds, you wanted to have the most miles. So each was competing to build the fastest across the continent. So the building of the Transcontinental Railroad was set up for the two companies to compete. Each of these companies are going to use a heavy population of immigrants to build the railroad, specifically Chinese and Irish immigrants. Um, the Transcontinental Railroad, the goal was to connect the continent, to connect all of this new land out in the West and provide a faster, easier means of transportation westward. The Homestead Act I mentioned, but we're going to get into it now. The Homestead Act of 1862 was passed under the Republican idea of pushing westward. Okay, Lincoln is going to promote the Homestead Act and state that 160 acres of land would be given to any adult that would promise to work the land for 5 years. You just had to move there, you just had to live there, and you could have 160 acres scot-free for 5 years. It was yours. So the Homestead Act is another way of encouraging people to move westward. Here's some free land, go out there and work and live. The gold rush is also going to take place during this time. The finding flecks of gold that is going to encourage people to push uh, westward to California and look for their riches. Now, flecks of gold was all that was found. Nobody was finding 100-pound nuggets of gold out in the West regularly, okay? But the idea that you could go out there and get rich quick, because that's all we want to do is get rich quick, push people to move west, and the Transcontinental Railroad made that easier. The Homestead Act also encouraged people to move west. The Transcontinental Railroad, the Homestead Act, the Gold Rush, all were pieces that encouraged westward expansion, encouraged people to push west. Now, when we think of the West, we are going to run into again. There are Native Americans out west. Remember, in the 1830s, Jackson forcibly relocated Native Americans to the West. He forced them to that new Indian territory that was in modern day Oklahoma, and now we have people who are moving out west again because of westward expansion, and we're gonna push the Native Americans again. Many of the Native American tribes were located along land that the railroads also wanted for construction. And as the railroads were constructed, new towns began to pop up in the West. And again, the Native Americans were going to be seen as savages, as threats, and the white settlers pushing westward are going to want them to move again. In the late 1860s, many Native Americans are going to be forced onto reservations, which were specifically government allocated areas set aside for Indian use. During Reconstruction, plans are going to be made by the government to bring Native Americans into the fold of the United States. But these plans were never put into clear directives, and they often resembled the reforms for emancipated slaves. But again, the federal government didn't have the capacity nor the money to put this into place, and a lot of these Reconstruction plans were okay, force the Native Americans to assimilate or be brought into or replicate white culture, not let's figure out a safe space for the Native Americans to live that would compensate them for the years of mistreatment. So while the Reconstruction plan said, yes, we'll bring Native Americans into the fold, it was under the stipulations of the whites, not a fair not a fair treatment in the slightest. As we have seen in the past, when the Native Americans are forced from their land, there is Native American resistance. We are going to see that at Little Bighorn. Little Bighorn is going to be where the Sioux were led by Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse to defeat George Armstrong Custer. This is General Custer. After the battle, the army tracked down the Sioux and they surrendered. But Sitting Bull and a few others are going to flee to Canada. Um, and we could get into Custer's last stand and the resistance of the Native Americans and how this long standing battle continued. But what this represents here, Little Bighorn, is that the Native Americans again are saying, we are not going to move quietly. You have removed us from our land so many times. And again, we have white generals coming out to lands that you forced us to be on, and now you're forcing us to move again. So, long standing history of Native Americans being forcibly removed. More Native American resistance here at Wounded Knee in 1890. What had been happening is there was a religious revival movement called the Ghost Dance. Now, the Ghost Dance was performed and taught to Native Americans that those that had been defeated and confined to the reservations, that when they did this, they were turning their back on their traditional customs. And as the Native Americans turned their back on their customs and traditions, the gods viewed that as abandoning their tradition, their customs. And in the Native American culture, that is the worst thing that you could do. One of the worst things that you could do is kind of turn your back on the customs and traditions of your tribe. And the ghost dance was meant to kind of get the Native Americans to right the wrongs that the gods had seen in their past. Because the wrongs, the punishment of those wrongs was supposed to be the reservation system. So Native Americans were doing the ghost dance to get in favor with the gods and to be brought out of the reservations. Now, the U.S. Army is going to be sent to stop the ghost dance because it's seen as a Native American resistance movement, even though it's more of a religious movement. When the army was sent to stop the ghost dancers, there is going to be a the Native Americans are not going to stop immediately, and the army is going to see that as a resistance. Fight is going to break out between the U.S. soldiers and Native Americans. A shot is going to be fired. It's unclear which side that shot came from, and a brutal massacre is going to follow where over 150 Native Americans are going to be killed, mostly women and children, where the cavalry, the soldiers, are only going to lose 25. Now, that number of 150 Native Americans, some historians who study this event put that number at nearly double that. So they say it was more like 300. And the picture that you see here is how the soldiers were burying the Native Americans. They dug a hole, they threw them all in the same hole, and they walked away as if nothing happened. So the massacre at Wounded Knee really again shows us how the Native Americans were treated. They were performing a religious ceremony, and they are met with a massacre. This conflict here in history is going to be referred to as a battle, even though it was not. It was really a tragic and unavoidable, or a tragic and avoidable massacre. It again goes to show us that the Native Americans are being mistreated for simply existing on territory that we put them in. The Dawes Act, I need you to put a big star next to this in your brain because the Dawes Act often comes up on the regents. The reservation system didn't seem to be working for the government anymore because now we wanted the lands that the reservations were put on um, for the railroads and for towns as we were moving westward. So the reservation system is going to be replaced with the allotment system. This ended tribal control of reservations and took the land that Native Americans were on and divided it into individual holdings. So individuals would then have control of the land instead of the tribes together. Each Native American family was awarded up to 160 acres of farmland, but they were given this land with stipulations. Uh, and these stipulations included assimilating to American ways of life. They had to farm the land, and if they were given farmland and told to farm, we were hoping that they would just become more white. Um, and it was an attempt to assimilate Native Americans into white life. At this time, missionaries were also sent across the native lands to build and create boarding schools that would take in young Native American boys and girls and teach them white history, white religion, and kind of convince them to not be Native anymore. And I know the picture over on the side here is hard to see, but on this part of the picture, you have the before traditional Native garb, the long hair on the boys, and then over here you can see on the edge the dress changes, the haircut changes, and this is what these schools did when the missionaries were sent out to collect Native Americans to attend these schools. They were teaching the white way of life because we wanted to essentially teach Native culture out of the Native Americans. Assimilate is the key word that you need to associate with the Dawes Act. Assimilate Native Americans into a more American way of life, the Dawes Act. Okay, don't forget to do your homework on Plessy versus Ferguson tonight. Any questions, please let me know. Have a great day, guys.